Hey everybody, this is Mr. Moppin coming back at you again with part 4, and yes, the final part of AP Government Topic 1.9, focusing in on federalism in action. Now, we've talked previously about the importance of the role of various aspects of government regarding policy. We've talked about environmental policy in parts 1 and 2, and then we started getting into marijuana policy in part 3. Today what we're going to do is going to wrap up our look at marijuana policy, and as we're going through this, like with the other parts, always remember that you want to be thinking about what roles are the federal government playing versus what the state governments are playing. Remember, it's not so much the details of the policy themselves that are as important as being able to know how does the federal government relate with the state government, vice versa, how the different branches of government relate together, and then also what role do we play as citizens in the political participation process regarding policy. So keep all those things in mind as we're rounding out our discussion looking at marijuana policy. Now, last time when we did introduce marijuana policy, we talked about how by the time we get to the 1970s, the federal government had asserted much broader control over drug policy in general, declaring that war on drugs in the early 1970s, and of course specifically looking at marijuana, scheduling it as a Schedule 1 drug, making the argument that it had no legitimate value at all, be it recreational or medicinal. Now, of course, that came at a time where the vast majority of Americans did support strong anti-drug policies. Once again, back in the 1970s, the vast majority of Americans wanted marijuana illegal. But we mentioned that through the mobilization of interest groups, such as NORML, and changing cultural values, including more of a evidence-based notion that marijuana may have some medicinal benefits, we see that the popularity in terms of the notion that marijuana should be legalized is growing as we go into the 90s. And that's really just going to continue. And as we've said before, policy tends to follow popular sentiment. And marijuana policy certainly is an example of that. For example, in 1996, we see a landmark action take place by the state of California via a referendum. And remember, a referendum is when the people themselves vote on a ballot issue. California voters voted in 1996 to legalize medical marijuana, making California the first state in the union to do so. Now, once this happens, we will start to see a number of states begin to follow. And once again, that's another one of the beauties of federalism, is that using state-level powers, you can have different states decide to kind of be on the vanguard regarding certain types of policy that might be controversial, such as marijuana policy. And if it seems to not hurt that state, then other states will generally tend to follow. Now, note, as we get into the 2000s, as more and more states are beginning to adopt legalizing medical marijuana, you can also, once again, go back and take a look at this poll. As we get into the 2000s, once again, we see the amount of Americans wanting to legalize marijuana grow and grow and grow. And right around 2012, you can see here on this graph that we reach a tipping point. Right around 2012 is where we start to see for the first time Americans, majority of Americans, supporting the legalization of marijuana. And note, this is going to have an effect on not just states making a decision to legalize medical marijuana, but also legalizing it for recreational purposes. By 2013, you can see that Colorado and Washington will legalize recreational marijuana for the first time. So you are seeing states taking the initiative to create policies that are more reflective of what popular sentiment is. Now, what's interesting about the policies that have been created with regards to marijuana usage anyway, is that it tends to kind of follow a track of first legalizing the drug for medicinal purposes and if it seems to, go okay for the population, then moving in the direction of legalizing for recreational purposes. And kind of show you that if you don't follow that track, it's not is likely to move forward with that kind of legislation. Ohio is a great example of that. In 2015, we saw a referendum put on the ballot that would have allowed for recreational marijuana to be legalized. But that failed, and it actually failed by a pretty big margin. Now, that being said, the very next year, the General Assembly, Ohio's state legislature, will vote to legalize medicinal marijuana. And we're starting to see that policy just in the last 2 years rolling out actually into fruition. And so we will see. It'll be an interesting question whether or not Ohio will follow in the same path as many other states, starting with the approval of medicinal marijuana and then moving into legalization of recreational marijuana. Now, once again, as I mentioned, this policy, in particular with marijuana, I do want to make the very explicit point that I am not endorsing any one of these policies in any way, shape, or form. It's just to be mindful of what the policies are. Now, note what I've started off with in this lesson is talking about how states have been moving in the direction of legalization of marijuana. You might be thinking, well, hold on a second. I thought we had, federal legislation. If you scroll back up here, if you go back to the Controlled Substances Act of 1970, I thought the federal government really had the authority on whether or not marijuana could be legal in any way, shape, or form. And that is true. And this is, once again, one of the interesting, components about federalism. To what degree will the federal government enforce policies upon states that are actively challenging and actively passing legislation counter to what the federal government wants? And the very question of, could the federal government force a state like California, for example, to comply with federal guidelines, even though the state has already created conflicting state laws? In the case of Gonzalez versus Raich, we actually do see that the court, in a 6-3 ruling, sides with the federal government, arguing that the Commerce Clause does include the ability of the federal government to regulate marijuana as a drug in this country. So in other words, those federal laws are constitutional, and it does mean the federal government has the authority to crack down on states if they do not comply with federal guidelines. Now, note, just because the federal government has the authority and the right to enforce said laws doesn't necessarily mean that they will. As evidence, you look at the Obama administration. During the Obama years, we saw that the Department of Justice basically had a policy that they were not going to enforce federal marijuana laws in states where they have already legalized that drug. And so that shows that states can assert a certain degree of authority, or at least influence, on what the federal government will choose to do. Now, once again, if the federal government really wanted to be strict about this law, they could go in there with DEA agents, FBI agents, etc., and shut down any of these businesses and arrest those individuals that are involved in cannabis production and sales in all of these states that are doing it. But they made a decision not to do that. Now, of course, that's a Democrat administration, a more liberal-leaning administration. What happens when you change presidents and move in a Republican, more conservative direction under Donald Trump? Well, the Trump administration basically said that they were going to allow the local U.S. attorneys, all right, so those attorneys that are working for the Department of Justice in their localities, to determine whether or not they want to prosecute those that are involved in marijuana sales. And generally speaking, those folks in the Department of Justice at those local levels, all right, so you're talking about U.S. attorneys in, say, Los Angeles or San Francisco, those are going to be folks that live in that state and are very likely to support the prevailing state legislative stance on marijuana. So it's a little bit more of a decentralized way of kind of continuing what the Obama administration did. And with the Biden administration, kind of similar to what we talked about with regards to climate change policy, we saw the Biden administration go back to the Obama era enforcement policies. In other words, the federal government is not going to attempt to enforce federal marijuana laws in states where they've already legalized the drug. So it's kind of an interesting thing. If we see presidents like this continue in this way, you're going to have federal legislation that is on the books that outright outlaw marijuana, but would be de facto legalized because of federal enforcement policy that would basically not enforce the federal law if the states disagree with it. So it's kind of a really interesting, kind of a backwards way of asserting state rights to influence what the federal government does, even though the federal government actually has the authority to create and enforce said policies. So once again, when we look at marijuana or we look at the environmental policies of the United States in recent decades especially, once again, it's not super important that you know the details of all of these, but you should be able to use these as examples to be able to articulate the role that different branches play in the policy crafting and enforcing process, and whether or not policies are constitutional. You should also be able to use these as examples to be able to articulate the relationship between the federal and state governments with regards to policy creation and enforcement and all that kind of stuff. So anyhow, if you do have questions about this, just let me know. You'll see here down at the bottom, there's going to be an activity regarding working on the essay component of the AP government test, but we'll talk about that in class. So anyhow, we will see you next time. Bye-bye.